So firstly, Pat, thank you so much for joining me. For those of you that don't know who Pat is well renowned. She is one of the country's leading experts in the US on gender diversity and equality. She is a top rated trial lawyer. She has literally written the book on rainmaking, which I have right here. I was making notes on it in preparation for this. She speaks on women's rights and focuses on women and minorities and how to further careers. And we'll dive into a lot of those sessions. So in preparing for this, I really outlined 4 topics for us to dig deep into. The first was around rainmaking. This is just me because I am curious about this very much, as Pat is the author of the book. Really, what are the characteristics of a rainmaker, specifically from a law firm perspective? And I know we have a number of partners registered for this. The second is around career development, specifically for women. So, basically, as the legal profession continues to struggle with gender equality, how do we reverse this trend? What do we need to do to increase both the number of lawyers generally and certainly in more senior roles? And then lastly, to dive into bias as implicit bias, as well as the topic of mental health. We'll see how much of that we can get into. But Pat, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Ab. I really appreciate you having me on the program. And I've heard really wonderful things about your podcast or webinars, whatever the right name is for this. So many thanks for doing what you're doing to sort of spread the word to people about various topics that are really of interest to everyone in the legal profession. So many thanks.
No, and thank you for joining. So this is the first webinar, so we'll see how this goes. This is certainly an experiment, and really my aim today is to give you the platform and get out of the way. I do not profess to be an expert in any of these things, but if you wouldn't mind, if we start with the rainmaking aspect of things. So you conducted this sort of 2-year study in looking at rainmakers within law firms. If you wouldn't mind, and certainly for anyone who hasn't read this book, you should definitely read this book. It's, as you can see, it's not very thick, but it's full of wonderful information. Talk me through what were some of the key characteristics that you identified in those that rose to the top of the field.
Yeah, so let me sort of back up for a minute and say the reason I did this study was because I was really interested in why I, who is someone who's not that special, was able to control a very, very large business for most of my 40-year career in big law. And so I got together with a professor at Indiana Law, a guy named Bill Henderson, who's a fabulous guy. And he agreed that he would get some real experts, not me, to help do a study of what, if any, characteristics distinguish rainmakers from other people. So we embarked on this study and we identified rainmakers as being someone who had controlled at least $4 million of business for a sustained period of time. We had another category called client service partners, which were people who were extremely valuable to the firm, but for whatever reason didn't control business. And then we tested them. We gave them tests that they never would have consented to if they knew what we were doing, which is we gave them sales tests, psychological tests that we use to measure sales abilities. And the reason I say lawyers would never agree to take the test if they knew what it was is because we don't think of ourselves as salespeople, and yet that's exactly what we are. When we're developing business, we're selling ourselves, our expertise, our firms, our record. That's what we're doing, but we don't admit it because we're the only profession that calls everyone else in the world nons, right? There are non-lawyers. There's no such thing as a non-CEO. There's no such thing as a non-physician, but there are non-lawyers. And that's because we think of ourselves as being very special. So we would never engage in something like sales, but in fact we do. So anyway, we gave this test or 2 tests to all these people who we identified across the country. We had about 300 people participate in our study. And then we also did some behavioral interviewing to get background facts on them. And what we found, in fact, is that there are characteristics that distinguish rainmakers from other lawyers who are client service partners. And those 4 characteristics are engagement, dominance, motivation, and risk-taking. And I'll just quickly tell you what each of those are, if that's okay. Engagement is basically active listening. the ability to listen to someone and take in information instead of listening to someone and think about what you're going to say in response. So rainmakers are interested in people. They're interested, they're interesting. They like to talk to people. They want to find out what makes someone tick. And what they're doing is forming the basis for a relationship. Because what we know about rainmaking is that your reputation has a lot to do with your ability to develop business, but your ability to develop relationships is just as important. So there are plenty of people who have great reputations, but they should basically be locked in a room and never allowed to see anyone because they're weird. But then there are people who have a good reputation and know how to develop relationships. And that is the engagement part, the active listening part, the ability to take information and incorporate it into your conversations with that person, to be thinking about what you can do for that person versus what they can do for you, finding ways to connect with them, finding ways to integrate both your professional life and your personal life. And that doesn't mean you don't have a personal life, but me as a rainmaker, I don't think of those as two separate things. People I develop as clients are people I like as friends. I have them over to my house. I connect with them. I know when they're having babies. I know when they're having trouble. I know when their first kid went to college. So a rainmaking call for me would be, hi, Ab. I understand your kid just went off, well, I guess not anymore, but in the old days, just went off to his first day of school. How was that? Because I remember when my kid did that, right? I'm not asking for business, I'm just connecting. So that's engagement, the ability to really be interested and interesting to people. Dominance, which I'm not crazy about the name of that, is really persuasion. It's the ability to find a way to be persuasive with the person with whom you're dealing. And that requires that you really understand the person's business. And this is something that a lot of lawyers don't understand. We sort of swoop in and we say, we're the lawyers, we're important, we're smart. Let us tell you what you should do. Really, the only way you can be effective, in my opinion, is if you understand the business of the client. And so I was in-house at Bank of America for 6 years. I really learned how the banking industry worked. And when I began to build my business when I left, who do you think my first clients were? Every single bank in the state of California, well, big bank in the state of California, because I understood the business. I could talk business talk. And that's what lawyers forget. We think it's really interesting that there's a difference in the Fifth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit in terms of their opinions, and this may go to the Supreme Court, but only if this when you're in-house as a lawyer or when you're a business person, honestly, you may care, but you've got 1,000 other things to worry about besides the Fifth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit. So dominance is the ability to really understand the business and to talk like a business person, not like a lawyer. And so what you're looking for is to understand what the business goals of the client, potential client are, and how you can help them realize those business goals. And that may be, we're going to take a case that may be a terrible case to take to trial, but their goal is to make a point. Or it may be we're going to settle a case early on because they want to get out of this because of their reputation or the legal expense associated with it. You have to understand the business reason, and you have to be able to talk in business speak, not legalese. The third element is motivation, which is the ability to motivate people, obviously. But what we found with rainmakers was really interesting, and that is that they aren't necessarily good team players, which I sort of take personal offense at because I think I'm a pretty good team player, but we aren't really good team players because we view our team as being the client, not the people in the office. We have client service partners who run the team in the office for us, who make sure the trains run on time, make sure that the client's kept informed, et cetera, et cetera. But the rainmaker is the one who's always partnering with the client. So I had such a good partner relationship with my clients that they felt like they were part of my team. I'd call them when I was going to trial and say, hey, I'm going to trial in another case, not your case. This is what I'm thinking about doing for an opening statement. What do you think? And I would get great feedback because most in-house people, especially now, are experienced lawyers who have really great insight. What does that do? Number one, it cements a relationship. Number two, it shows that I honored them and I considered them to be part of my team. And the last factor we found was risk-taking. Rainmakers are huge risk takers. So when we hear someone say no, what we hear is not now, not now. Let me try again in a couple months. because as we know, developing these kinds of relationships that lead to business take a long time. So risk-taking is critical. And if I had, although we didn't find any difference, not a single difference between men and women in doing this testing, men and women rainmakers test exactly the same. Rainmakers and client service partners test differently, but it's not gender-based. But if I had to say anecdotally, what I think women have the most problem with is risk-taking, because we're the ones who say, oh, there's a job out there, there are 10 qualifications, I have 8, but I don't have those other 2, so I'm not going to apply. What does a guy do? He's like, there's a job out there, 10 qualifications, I've got 5, I can fake it, I'll apply for the job, right? We're not as, I don't think, as willing to take risks, and rainmaking requires risk, because you've got to go out there, you're going to ask for business, and you're going to be told no. And you have to be willing to take that and not take it personally. So those are the 4 factors we identified that came out of the psychological testing. And I will tell you, when I give this talk, which I do nationally at retreats and conferences and ABA meetings, people who are rainmakers will say, absolutely, this resonates with me, absolutely. And I want to say one more thing, because it's really important. I don't mean to in any way demean or disparage client service partners. For rainmakers, client service partners are extremely important. We are not good at detail. We're not good at the small picture. We're good at the big picture. And so the client service partners are critical to our teams. And if I had to change one thing in law firms, what I would change is this. I'd pay the client service partners more than the rainmakers, because we can't do our job without those client service partners. Unfortunately, in law firms, it's all about how much business you bring in, or at least in the past, that's what it's been about.
Yeah.
So that's the Rainmaker study.
That's amazing. And yeah, so just as a recap, so the 4 characteristics that I jotted down were engagement, dominance, despite the name, it's basically persuasion and coming up with solutions that are, I think you underlined it, that are business oriented, motivation. So, and actually really, how do you act as a team with your client, right? So you sort of look at that in a holistic view, and taking risk. So hearing no means not now. And I mean, a couple of funny things. So as you were telling that story around, people, the differences between men and women, I speak to my wife all the time about this, because if we look at roles, I frankly think it's a bit of arrogance on a man's part. Frankly, I have it. I'll admit to it, that I see a role where I might, as your example, maybe meet 8 out of 10 requirements. I'm like, well, it's okay. I'm 80% of the way there. The other 20% will come, right? And or at least at the minimum, I am willing to sort of go in there and say, you know what, that's okay. Let's deal with it if it comes up. Let's work with what we have, and then we'll figure out the other 20% of the way. And yeah, I think societally, it is something that for whatever reason, women don't do as well, partly because I think in the past they've been discouraged from following through with that, right? Just the role models, and otherwise it's been that you gotta have 100% before you go for something. Whereas as certainly as a young kid, you just as a boy, you go for it. You're like, yeah, it's okay, we'll just figure it out.
Yeah, and you've hit on exactly what I think is the issue, and that is, although you didn't express it this way, it's the perfect factor, the P factor. Women believe they have to be perfect. Yeah. And so if they don't meet perfection in their minds, then they're afraid to go forward. Or if they go forward and they're told no, then that means you're being rejected. And that feels bad. I mean, we tend to be more relationship oriented. And so we tend to take things personally. And what I try to really emphasize with women who I mentor and who I talk to is, it's not personal, it's business. It's business to a point. It gets personal when you form those relationships. And I got to tell you, my clients would never leave me. I mean, we had such a strong relationship, they'd be embarrassed to leave me as a client. And that's what you want to have. You want to have that cemented relationship. I'm looking out for you, you're looking out for me. We're in this together. And so let's help each other. And that sort of reciprocal relationship is really important, because lawyers tend to always think what you can do for me versus what can I do for you. Yeah. And it's putting yourself on the line a little bit when you offer to do something for someone else, because you got to follow through. But it can be little things. It can be calling someone about, they're looking for a preschool, and you say, well, here's 3 preschools that I looked at, or somebody's kid is leaving for college and say, oh, my kid went to school near there, make sure you go to the Target, on X Street. It can be something as simple as that, or I know you're unhappy in your job. I've just heard about another opening in another company that might be useful for you. Is that client going to lose? Are you going to lose that client if they go someplace else? No, because when they go to that new job, they are totally loyal to you. But again, it's putting yourself on the line, and you've got to be willing to take that risk.
And I think it's so important, and I do want to move into other things as well, but I think it's super important because I'm a revenue leader in a legal tech business, but as I look at the rainmakers, or the super high performers within the field, one of the things I know is for them, they make all of these things so seamless, right? This is not work for them. This is just something that is almost natural, whether it's trained. And I believe, at least this is my belief, that you can train people into these skills, because sometimes these are seen as softer skills. I think they're anything but. They are so important, the most important skills. But it takes deliberate work and practice to do that. It takes a lot of grit to go through a lot of these motions, because as you look to get better in any of these areas, you will fail, and you will fail a lot, right? You will be rejected time and time and time again. And you have to learn from those experiences. You have to get to the top. What's your, and I know one of the other things, specifically for lawyers and legal professionals, is the fact that you have to be thinking about, I think you hit on it before, the big picture, the business of the law firm, as well as the business of your clients, right? Because, it's too easy to just say, I'm going to solve this problem. You're not going to, yeah, fine, you'll do a good job, but you will not become a rainmaker that way, because if you just provide the most obvious solution, you're not adding any more value than the next person, right? What you need to do is provide really a longer term strategic vision to them, to say, this is how I've solved your problem today, and these are the things that you should do to ensure you don't have the same problem again in a year's time or in 6 months' time. So how do you work with individuals or teams to instill some of their skills?
Yeah, so I want to back up again and just say what's really interesting about the Rainmaker study is that we identified characteristics, but we also identified background information that was fascinating, right? What we found was that people who were top of their class were not necessarily rainmakers. People who went to the best schools in the country were not likely to be rainmakers. Not that they aren't, but they weren't likely to be. We found that rainmakers were people who came from blue-collar families for the most part, who didn't come from any type of privileged background, who worked during law school or during college, and mostly in the service industry, as you can imagine, because at that age, that's what you do. But they learned how to listen for what the customer wants, and to how to respond. So there's one guy who was on a program with me who was a salesperson during high school and college in one of those stores that sells athletic shoes. And he said it was the best thing, because people would come in and they'd be looking for, X type of shoe, and he knew that they really needed Y type of shoe. And his goal became, in every sale, can I move them over to this shoe? And that's exactly what you're doing as a rainmaker. So when I'm talking to people about how to improve their rainmaking skills, and Ab, I agree with you, there's some people who come by it naturally. So I'm a natural rainmaker. I don't have to think about these things. And then, as I said, there's some people who should never be allowed to try this. And then there are people in the middle who can be trained. And that's where I'm really interested. I'm interested in that group, because we have not traditionally trained that group. Or we've thought if we just give them a little session on rainmaking, somehow they'll miraculously turn into rainmakers. But you have to teach people how to listen, how to be innovative and creative and strategic in the way they're thinking, and how to communicate that to their clients. You have to exercise that part of the brain, and that takes risk-taking, right? I'm going to propose a solution that's sort of crazy, but it might work. So I always give an example of one of the things I used to do as a trial lawyer is, instead of hiring jury consultants to help me develop a theme for a case, I would hire advertising agencies, right? Completely out of the box. It's expensive, by the way, but I'm selling a product to a jury. So I want to know what's going to sell. Now, that's something most corporations have never heard of, and they're really sort of taken aback by it. And even though many companies didn't agree to do it, they always remembered that I suggested it, right? And what that shows them is I'm thinking out of the box, I'm thinking strategically, I'm thinking, how can I really accentuate what's the most important thing for you, which is winning the case by bringing in the best expert I can bring in. Now, because it's so costly, I didn't do that. So the way you train people is you tell them what it's about, and then you tell them to exercise those muscles. So for risk taking, I say, go out and take a risk every day. That risk may be, walking across the street on a red light. I don't want to get killed, or, trying to go to the restroom in a restaurant that you're not eating at in the old days. Or calling up someone who you haven't called up in a long time to say, hey, what's up with you? Can we get together for lunch? Or asking a partner to what they're working on and saying, I'd like to volunteer to work on that. It's those kinds of things where you practice those skills that really develop that muscle that you need to become a rainmaker.
Yeah, and what I will say is, as you do these things, I can relate to a lot of these things, because at some point, a lot of, what Pat is describing will just seem like common sense. Like, why wouldn't I do that? And I think that's a good indication that you're on the right path, that you're developing those skills, as well as the results that you'll see, of course. So before we move on to the sort of focusing on sort of career development and focusing on women specifically, anyone else who's listening, feel free to please unmute yourself if you have any questions, if you have comments as well. Certainly don't want this to be a bi-directional discussion only. I know a number of you are experts in your field, have led firms, are leading firms. But if you want to chime in, please feel free to do so. I'll pause for a second. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Pat, could I ask some questions?
Absolutely, Lama, and wonderful to speak to you again.
Indeed, and thank you for setting this up. And Pat, thank you for coming to talk to us. I've seen some of Ab's work as well, and have been fascinated by how he's bringing all these different experts together. So great to hear your insights. And in fact, I'm sitting here and thinking, gosh, could we have a law school course on rainmaking, please? And where was all this earlier? We were all in law school. Can I ask 3 questions, if I may, just because that's reacting to where you were just now commenting on. So one was specifically in relation to your study. I'd be so curious to have a chance to go through that. Is that something that's still ongoing, or is that closed as part of the study that you were doing? So in effect, which category do we all fall into? Is that still an option to explore?
Yeah, so no, unfortunately, we don't have the study open anymore. But, you can probably tell by your own career trajectory where you fall on the scale. And you can assume you're a natural rainmaker. If what I've said about these 4 categories resonates with you and you're like, oh, I do that anyway, then you're probably a natural rainmaker, and you just need to begin to exercise those skills in your business relationships as well as your personal relationships. Because a lot of times people are quote unquote rainmakers, they're showing these skills in their personal relationships, but they haven't translated that to developing business for their careers. So, if you feel that way, if you feel like, no, I really am not a risk taker, then you need to start exercising that muscle and begin. I mean, I had a friend who said she was going to take a risk. And this was when Uber first came out. And she said, Pat, I went to Palo Alto in an Uber. And I'm like, okay. Why was that a risk? She goes, because I didn't know if I could get back, which I thought was hilarious. I'm like, the cars run both ways. But, that was a risk for her, and the beginning of sort of challenging herself to step outside of her safety zone.
That's brilliant to hear. I had the classic, I think, response, well, at least classic for me, where it's like, I feel like I'm about 80% there. Being right. But on that note as well, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts more in relation to law being largely a male-dominated world, and certainly the client world that I'm facing in my world, which is antitrust being my area and practice, is that it's also very largely male-dominated with a few exceptions. And from your experience, in terms of women to succeed, both as rainmakers or just generally running legal practices, in your experience, is it in that kind of world more important to become more manly, or becoming more of your own brand, which then does have those touches and that kind of level of engagement which you described around children and otherwise, which I tend to more associate with females in the profession than necessarily the more kind of aggressive male colleagues of mine. What are your thoughts and observations on that point?
So first, I couldn't agree with you more with respect to the antitrust lawyer bar. And, antitrust lawyers think they're the most brilliant people in the world, and none of us should even try to speak with them. So I'm glad you're talking to me. And employment lawyers, which is what I was, are the lowest of the chain, even though we may have more business and have been to trial more often than any other freaking antitrust lawyers. But having said that, I would never recommend that you try to be more manly. I don't think that's the way that you have to be authentic as a rainmaker. You have to be true to yourself and who you are. And I'll tell you the leg up that women have over men, whether it's antitrust or securities litigation or commercial litigation or employment. We know how to form relationships. And so when you start out, what you're doing, let's take the antitrust example, you're starting out working with people in an organization if you're allowed to even interact with the client, which you should ask for opportunities to do. But you start out interacting with people who are at a lower level in the organization. You want to connect with them. You want to form that relationship. And then, you know what? They're going to move up in their careers. Not every one of them, but most of them are going to move up in their careers to where they get into a position where they can either recommend people for business or they can get business out. And so I'm going to just encourage you to form relationships in a way that feels comfortable for you, but that stretches yourself a little bit so that you make that phone call to the person that you've been interacting with who's on the low level, and you say, hey, why don't we grab a drink? Or, hey, let's go get coffee. Or, do you have time to talk? I just want to catch up. Or you send them an email saying, I know you're interested in this. Here's something, here's an article about it. That you begin to develop those relationships and use those connecting skills that, and obviously I'm stereotyping here because I think Ab's pretty good at this too, but women have a unique ability to form relationships. We know how to do that. That's what we're really good at. We know how to listen and we know how to get into that. So what I find with a lot of my male clients is they talk to my male colleagues completely different from the way they talk to me, right? They talk to me about their house, their kids, their despairs, their triumphs. And it's a completely different type of conversation because it's safe to talk to me about that. And we have as strong a relationship as if we were talking football or soccer or, some macho thing. Although I can talk football because I love football. But I would never recommend that you become more manly. I think you build on the skills that are authentic to you. And if those include manly skills, use them. But you don't have to be a man to be a rainmaker.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Pat. Much appreciated.
Now, did you have a third question as well, or were they all of them? Covered everything.
Sorry, that is everything. You'll be glad to hear.
No, absolutely. Please do feel free to chime in. And yeah, we want this to be a conversation. So feel free to interrupt, certainly me, anytime and ask away. And actually, I would say, Pat, one of the ways, so I was not a great networker for a long time. And one of the things that really helped me, and I'm still working on it, by no means am I perfect, is looking at individuals who are really good, especially when it comes to networking via sort of a digital way, right? On LinkedIn, that's my defined platform. And frankly, the way I did that, I looked at people that had things that were somewhat of interest and not always legal, but things of interest to me generally in the business world, and that had a huge following on LinkedIn. And I reached out to them, and I can tell you with confidence that probably 8 out of 10 of them, those individuals, were women. And just asking them makes a huge difference, right? Oh, I see that you have 10,000 people following you, or 100,000 sometimes. How did you get to this point? What did you do? What worked for you? Or I see, and I actually did see this example recently, someone had in their LinkedIn title, they put in the words, let's be LinkedIn friends. And I wrote to her, and she had 108,000 followers on LinkedIn, which is stupid, so high, yeah. And she replied, and I said, look, I does that work for you, right? Is that why you have so many followers? Because I want to copy you. I was quite honest, and I will copy her. And she did. She said, yeah, it works really well. She also went viral with one of her articles. But I think doing those kinds of things, people that you see as doing well in what they're doing, I'm certainly open to just asking them. And I'm a huge fan of just copying people with permission, because you do not need to reinvent the wheel most of the time. You start by copying, then you make things better from there.
Exactly. And, that's a really important point, is the whole issue of asking. Again, this is sometimes harder for women than it is for men. Men will be on the golf course playing golf, and they'll, slap each other on the butt and say, hey, how come I don't do your business, right? Well, a woman would never do that, right? We wouldn't slap someone on the butt, I don't think. But besides that, we wouldn't say, why don't I have your business? We'd feel uncomfortable with that, in part because we might get a no. But learning to ask in a way that feels comfortable for you is really, really important. And you'd be surprised. I'm always amazed when I became a partner. People thought that, I guess I changed. All of a sudden, I'm morphed into some terrible person who they were afraid to talk to, even though, the day before I'd been fine to talk to. What people don't realize is that for the most part, people are more than happy to help you, to share information if you reach out to them. And if they aren't, then who cares? You haven't lost anything. All you've done is made an ask that you got a no to. But if you reach out and do exactly what you did, have to say, does this work? How did you do it? What do you think works? What doesn't work? Can I work on your project? Can I go? I mean, those kinds of things, you'd be surprised at the responses. Most people, I think, who are baby boomers, who are on their way out, are more than happy to share information, to share ideas, and help you in your career. So, I would echo your indication that you should go out and ask.
Yeah, thank you. That gives me confidence for sure. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind, let's switch gears a little bit, and we'll talk about something a bit deeper, which is sort of both career development, which we've been touching on a little bit, but also I certainly wanted to touch on bias and mental health as well, because I don't think anyone will dispute this, but certainly a lot of law firms specifically, and that's the world I know, and I'm sure it penetrates other businesses too. There's a lot of work, and there's a lot of supposed work around sort of business development training, diversity programs, and and the like, and it hasn't really moved the needle enough in what should happen when it comes to. I don't think you can completely, obliterate bias, but to minimize bias, as well as bring a focus to mental health issues. And I know you've done some work on this as well. So if you wouldn't mind, could you give us a bit of background in some of the work that you've done? And, frankly, I'm interested in your opinions in what should happen. What can we do?
Yeah, so you've hit on a real important note for me, especially in these times where we're finally addressing racial injustice. I just think it's really critical that we think about how we're doing this, because for years what we've been doing, and I've been pretty outspoken on this, is putting a Band-Aid on the problems. And so we do things that make us feel good as organizations. For example, we get on the A list, which the American Lawyer publishes, or we get listed as working mother, one of the top firms, or we get rated by the NCCA as a firm that has good stats, but we don't get to what the underlying issues are. And so I believe training is a really important component of moving the dial on bias. However, training only raises consciousness. That's all it does. It makes you more aware that everybody has biases, and that those play themselves out in ways that we may or may not be aware of. So some is intentional bias and some is unconscious bias. Unconscious bias, to me, as an employment lawyer in particular, is the hardest and the most prevalent. because these are the assumptions we make about other people, the stories we tell about other people before we know them. And that's really dangerous. We see someone, they have a hoodie on, they're African American, we assume they might be a bad guy, right? We all have those kinds of biases, and we need to recognize them, and training can help raise your self-awareness. But that's all it does. It doesn't cure bias, because you can't really cure bias. It doesn't eliminate it, and it doesn't move the dial. What moves the dial, and this is what just makes me crazy, are actions that actually have impact. And the way you measure that, you have to be able to measure that. So if you do a training program for years and years and years, and say we've trained all our partners on implicit bias, and we still only have one African American or Black partner, something isn't working. Or if we look at the stats for women, I mean, how long have we been talking about women, and we need to advance them into positions of leadership? And yet, we have few women in leadership positions in firms across the country. So what I really suggest, and what I really advocate in my discussions on this, my trainings that I do on this, is you have to go beyond the training and look at, do systemic evaluations of the institution. How are assignments being made? Who gets put on the big cases? Who gets speaking roles in deals or in litigation matters? Who goes out on pitches for new clients? Who gets credit for those new clients? How do we determine compensation? Are we rewarding people who advance the interest of women and diverse attorneys? Or do we not take that into consideration? Is it on the form but not really considered when you're determining compensation? Because as we know, lawyers measure themselves by how much they get paid. And so you identify the places where you can see that these are the things that lead to success in a law firm. And are we really treating everyone equally? So let's just take assignments. Who gets assigned to what kinds of cases? If you start to monitor that and look at it and say, okay, well, what we see is that on these big cases with our biggest clients, it's all white males. Now, there may be a reason for that. I can't imagine what it is, but there may be a reason for that that is completely unrelated to discriminatory bias. But there may be something else. There may be bias playing into that. And so you begin to institute systems that make change. And the system would be, we're going to monitor it. We're going to make sure that in these big cases for our most important clients, where you get exposure and you get credit and you get recognition, we're going to make sure that those teams are diverse. And that is coming from clients as well as from people within the firm. And clients have actually been more aggressive in this regard than our own law firms. They have said, we want diverse teams. Yeah. Now, of course, that's led to law firms playing with stats and putting people on teams but not really giving them work. And, there's all kinds of stuff. But it's that type of really systemic approach to the issues that are plaguing our industry and keeping people from moving into positions of power and authority. So my team at the Stanford Hackathon, which was held back in 2016, developed the Mansfield Rule. And even though we get no credit for it now, I had a team of wonderful people, and we came up with the Mansfield Rule, which is a rule that says for every leadership position, for every partnership position, for every compensation committee decision about who's going to be in those roles, you have to have 30% women and minorities. Now, when we did it only for women because that was the focus of the conference. But the Mansfield Rule has now been adopted across the country by, I think, 100 firms. And what we're beginning to see is that when you make an affirmative effort to seek out candidates who otherwise would not have been on anybody's radar to put into leadership positions, it makes a difference. They don't necessarily get into the role, but their visibility is increased, their name becomes more of a household word, and they eventually will move into positions of leadership. And it forces firms to develop the pipeline. No longer can it just be tap on the shoulder. Oh, now it's Joe's turn. Now it's Steve's turn. Now it's John's turn. Now you have to say we have a pool of candidates and 30% of that pool has to be women or diverse attorneys. So it's that kind of action in addition to training that really will make a difference and move the needle on bias that I think is just so embedded in our industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because as you said, the awareness point, which comes from training, is, I mean, it's the starting point. That has to be table stakes. If you don't have awareness, you cannot measure and you cannot do anything on. But the execution is where I see the biggest gap right now, because there's plenty of talk about it, right? And I believe it to be actually genuine concern, but there is something missing, that there's a disconnect from we care about this to we care enough about this to do something about it,
Oh,
because
really
that's
well
the biggest thing, right? And it's not, it's all of the things that you've said, and one of the most important that struck home with me there was giving people the opportunity, so they may not get that role at that time, and just being able to ensure that someone has their moment in the spotlight, because part of that, and we were talking about this earlier, is that actually creates this internal self-belief in that individual, that actually maybe I am a leader in this field. Because so much of this, depending on how long you've been rejected, can be this, this really quite hostile thing where, as a minority, as women, and others, that you feel maybe I'm not really ready for this role, but you have the opportunity, whether you get it or not, you know what, actually I was considered once, there's no reason I shouldn't go for it the next time around as well.
Exactly. And given your field, Deb, what's been really interesting is how technology has lent itself to eliminating some of these biases that many of us were just not aware of. I think those of us who do employment law were, but many others weren't. And that is, in something like a performance review or a job application, there's sometimes are words that are used that discourage people from applying for a job. So there are now programs that organizations can use that will go through your job application and eliminate gendered words and racial words. And they're not obvious. It's like, don't apply if you're a woman, but they're things that they believe psychologically would prevent a woman or a minority from applying for a particular job. Same thing with performance reviews. Where there's a program that goes through and takes out gendered words, like the word poised. I think Pat is really poised is different from saying, I think Pat has presence. I think she has gravitas, because poised is a female word. It's what you use to describe how women are versus men. So two performance reviews, one saying they're poised, the other saying this person has presence and gravitas. Who are you going to be more inclined to use? The person with presence and gravitas. So there are technological techniques and programs that are being used to sort of help us eliminate some of that unconscious bias that plagues us.
Yeah. And what I would say, what I've seen, which is actually, I guess, a indirect benefit of what's going on around the world right now, as most people are in lockdown and otherwise, because we've been doing a lot more of these meetings over Zoom, Teams, whatever your poison of choice is these days. We've noticed, and certainly I've noticed, that it gives people that wouldn't normally speak up, that wouldn't actually be invited into these meetings, a very open opportunity to join in, right? When you have a virtual meeting, it's difficult to put arbitrary restrictions around, sorry, this room can only hold X amount of people, or it looks weird, or whatever else it might be. And especially those that are a bit more quiet, a bit more introverted, whether by training or by the actual characteristic, do have an opportunity to come, and they can actually type things in the chat. If they don't like speaking in a group setting, even a small group like this, I completely get it. They can actually type a message, they can be heard. And that's been a huge benefit. And I genuinely hope that continues when we eventually move back to meeting people in a physical space.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. We were really worried about what would happen. We being those of us who speak on these issues a lot, what would happen with Zoom and these types of remote meetings. And what we're hearing pretty uniformly is that it's actually been a benefit to women and minorities, in part for the reasons that you've mentioned, that they tend to attend meetings they may not otherwise attend. and also because you can speak up and you can chat, or you can say, wait, I want to say that, or you can say, I think I just said that, when a man takes responsibility for something you just said. Um, so yeah, it's been an unexpected boon, I think, to that part of the issue.
Yeah. And the time has flown by. We have about 5 or so minutes, about 7 minutes left. Certainly want to open the floor to anyone who has questions, comments, just any other discussion points. Otherwise, we can start wrapping up. And please feel free to unmute yourself.
Pat, it's Kathleen.
Hi there.
Again. I want your book. So, is there a way of ordering it? The Rainmaker book?
I'll tell you what, anyone who wants it, send me an email, because I'll get you the family discount. I mean, I don't make any money off the book, so it doesn't matter to me, but it's really expensive what they charge for it. So send an email to me. My email is pkgillette, GILLETTE @gmail.com.
Perfect.
And then I'll make sure you get the good price.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun read. It's a quick read and it's pretty fun, I gotta say.
Yeah, I'm eager to look at that. So thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other?
Pat, it's Lauma here again. I wanted to add an observation just on the last point that you were just talking about. Simply just by reference to the circumstances I find myself in, being based in Europe, it's 7 p.m. on a Friday night, and an event like this would have probably been off the books on a normal quote-unquote world. But in the new normal world, I found that the kids are back from school and I'm able to put them in front of TV for that hour so that I can join and have these calls. And I really do have to say that there is something about the new normal that this pandemic is going to accelerate the adoption of quite a lot of the moves to a more gender neutral and gender balanced world, which law has been particularly bad at adopting and bringing into play. And that we're likely to have tried this because, of course, the whole world had no other choice. But now that we have, a lot of the employers will be faced with the option, well, how do I now say no? Seeing that obviously work did continue and things have been fine. So I'm actually interested to see how it will play out in your context, more in kind of the employment cases, and whether there are likely to be more of these kind of discussions that will be picked up. But equally also picking up on the point about the relationship building, the fact that there is a dog barking all of a sudden also for a male colleague, or that there's a cat meowing in the background, it has somehow made them more human and has created a space that allows us all to be more human and build relationships in a different kind of way. And so I'm really hoping that impetus that this crisis has given us will start, truly a new normal for the workplace as well, and that will then permeate into the areas that you were just discussing, making other opportunities more available to minorities and women that otherwise wouldn't have taken a stab at something because they would have self-elected out of something previously. So well done, and really inspirational, both of you guys. Well done for organizing this and offering your time and comments and thoughts and observations. Found this really, really valuable. Thank you from me.
Well, thank you for your nice comments. I just want to comment on the issue about dogs in the background. I mediate cases now. I've left my firms so I speak and I mediate cases, and it's hilarious because these really sort of what can I say, sort of dressed up men come in their ties and their coats and stuff. And we all know they have shorts on underneath, it's a given. But they come, and then all of a sudden a kid will walk into the room and say, "Daddy," and then they're like, "Oh my God." But it has humanized. I couldn't agree with you more. It's really humanized people and made them feel more comfortable and sort of let us all know that we all have personal lives as well as business lives. And that may involve kids, it may involve dogs, it may involve our moms or dads or, relatives, but it really has made a difference. And so I agree with you completely. I think this is a game changer. We'll see how it plays out, because I am worried also about layoffs and, who's going to be chosen, and diversity issues getting shoved to the bottom because, they're not money makers. But we'll see what happens. But I have great hope that we're going to see positive change come.
Pat, do you see in the work that you're doing I know you just said that diversity issues are not money makers. Do you see that shifting? Because I think some kind of awareness, but it's such a stuck problem, you know, to really overcome that. It's been like incremental, tiny change. But I'm wondering what you're seeing in that, because I tend to think they really are, they're game changers, but they're also money makers. Because if you can't have a robust, healthy, diverse workforce that looks like and mirrors what our cultures look like, it really impacts the bottom line. And people are much more savvy these days and so quick to do boycotts or to raise issues with respect to. So how are you seeing that kind of play out?
Yeah, so even before the pandemic, as I mentioned, clients are really putting pressure on firms to diversify their teams, to diversify their leadership teams as well as their work teams. And we were seeing clients move away from just getting statistical information and policy information from firms to actually saying, who's getting credit for this? How are you billing? Who's doing the work? Don't bring people to pitches or to my table who you're not going to put on the case to try to fool me into thinking that you're a diverse firm. So we were seeing that before. We're seeing it much more now. I mean, because everyone is aware that people are looking. And if you show up with all white guys at a meeting or at a pitch or even at trial, people are not going to feel good about this. And what we know, and you made this point sort of indirectly, but I'm going to make it directly, is that when we have diverse teams, when we have integration in thought, we have much better decision making. We have much more financial progress. We are better because you have diverse points of view. What studies have shown is if you have a homogeneous group together, you reach consensus pretty quickly because everybody thinks the same. If you have a diverse set of people are challenging each other because they bring different perspectives to that conversation, and better decisions are made. So I'm on the board of an organization called Direct Women, and we prepare women attorneys to be on corporate boards. We don't place them, but we prepare them. And traditionally, nobody wanted attorneys and nobody wanted women. But now, all of a sudden, what we're seeing is that everyone is recognizing, well, either because they're just crass and they realize they've got to have the appearance of diversity, or because they really do believe it, that they need to have women and minorities on their boards of directors. And so that's just a small indication, in my opinion, of what is happening, that we're having this awakening that I think will inure to the benefit of society and certainly to groups that have traditionally been underrepresented.
That's great. What's the name of your organization that works with women attorneys?
Direct Women.
Direct Women.
All one word, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, so we're just at time. So one of the things I certainly do is I'll send a recording of this conversation to everyone who registered. I know many people couldn't make it, but they wanted to register. For those that are joining us from Europe, and specifically, thank you for making time in the evening. For those joining in the US, thank you for taking some time in the middle of your day. Really appreciate it. Pat, of course, thank you so much. Really, really insightful conversation. I will also do some sort of key takeaways from this conversation as well, and send that through along with the recording as well, because I know people tend to ingest information in different ways. And yeah, Pat, thank you again for the offer. For those that want to read the book, I'll include the links as well.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me. And thanks to everyone who was on the call. It was really fun to have this kind of a conversation. So many thanks for your participation, and particularly the person in Europe. Although 7 o'clock on a Friday, I'd be drinking wine and having a pizza, I think. So you're a better person than I. All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.